Indians called all Americans Bostons. 9.3 The Jefferson Presidency. How did President Jefferson's political philosophy shape his administration's policies? At noon on March 4, 1801, Thomas Jefferson walked from his modest boarding house through the swampy streets of the new federal city of Washington to the unfinished Capitol. George Washington and John Adams had ridden in decorated carriages to their inaugurals. Jefferson, although accepting a military honor guard, demonstrated by his actions that he rejected the elaborate, quasi-monarchical style of the two Federalist presidents and their autocratic style of government as well. For all its lack of pretension, Jefferson's inauguration as the third President of the United States was a momentous occasion in American history, for it marked the peaceful transition from one political party, the Federalists, to their hated rivals, the Jeffersonian Republicans. Beginning in an atmosphere of exceptional political bitterness, Jefferson's presidency was to demonstrate that a strongly led party system could shape national policy without leading either to dictatorship or to revolt. Jefferson's own hope for moderation may have been the crucial factor. Trying to overcome the bitter political disagreements of the 1790s, Jefferson set a tone of conciliation in his inaugural address, announcing, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," and during his 8 years in office he paid close attention to ways to attract moderate Federalists to the Jeffersonian Republican Party. 9.3.1 Republican Agrarianism. Jefferson brought to the presidency a clearly defined political philosophy. Behind all the events of his administration and those of his successors, in what became known as the Virginia dynasty, was a clear set of beliefs that embodied Jefferson's interpretation of the meaning of republicanism for Americans. Jefferson's years as ambassador to France in the 1780s were particularly important in shaping his political thinking. Recoiling from the extremes of wealth and poverty he saw there, he came to believe that it was impossible for Europe to achieve a just society that could guarantee to most of its members the life, liberty and pursuit of happiness, of which he had written in the Declaration of Independence. Only America, he believed, provided fertile earth for the true citizenship necessary to a republican form of government. What America had, and Europe lacked, was room to grow. Jefferson envisaged a nation of small family farms clustered together in rural communities, an agrarian republic. He believed that only a nation of roughly equal yeoman farmers, each secure in his own possessions and not dependent on someone else for his livelihood, would exhibit the concern for the community good that was essential in a republic. Jefferson's vision of an expanding agrarian republic remains to this day one of our most compelling ideas about America's uniqueness and special destiny. But expansionism contained some negative aspects. The lure of the Western lands fostered constant mobility and dissatisfaction rather than the stable, settled communities Jefferson envisaged. Expansionism caused environmental damage, in particular soil exhaustion, a consequence of abandoning old lands, rather than conserving them, and moving on to new ones. Expansionism encouraged the spread of plantations based on slave labor in the South. Finally, it bred a ruthlessness toward Indian peoples, who were pushed out of the way for white settlement or who, like the Mandans, were devastated by the diseases that accompanied European trade and contact. Jefferson's agrarianism thus bred some of the best and some of the worst traits of the developing nation. 9.3.2 Jefferson's government. Thomas Jefferson came to office determined to reverse the Federalist policies of the 1790s and to ensure an agrarian republic of virtue. Accordingly, he proposed a program of simplicity and frugality, promising to cut all internal taxes, to reduce the size of the army, the navy, and the government staff, and to eliminate the entire national debt inherited from the Federalists. He kept all of these promises. This diminishment of government was a key matter of Republican principle to Jefferson. If his ideal yeoman farmer was to be a truly self-governing citizen, the federal government must not, Jefferson believed, be either large or powerful. Perhaps one reason for Jefferson's success was that the federal government he headed was small and unimportant by today's standards. For instance, Jefferson found only 130 federal officials in Washington. The national government's main service to ordinary people was mail delivery, and already in 1800 there were persistent complaints about the slowness, unreliability, and expense of the postal service. Everything else, law and order, education, welfare, road maintenance, economic control, rested with state or local governments. Power and political loyalty were still local, not national. This small national government also explains why for years the nation's capital was so unimpressive. The French designer Pierre L'Enfant had laid out a magnificent plan of broad streets and sweeping vistas reminiscent of Paris. Congress had planned to pay for the grand buildings with money from land sales in the new city, but few people besides congressmen and female boarding house keepers chose to live there. Construction lagged. The president's house lacked a staircase to the second floor until 1808, and the early Capitol consisted of first one white box and later two white marble boxes connected by a boardwalk. It is a telling indicator of the true location of national power that a people who had no trouble building new local communities across the continent were so slow to establish their federal city. 9.3.3 An independent judiciary, although determined to reverse Federalist fiscal policies, Jefferson was much more moderate concerning Federalist officeholders. He resisted demands by other Jeffersonian Republicans that all Federalist officeholders be replaced with party loyalists. During his term of office, Jefferson allowed 132 Federalists to remain at their posts, while placing Jeffersonian Republicans in 158 other posts. Jefferson's restraint, however, did not extend to the most notorious Federalist appointees, the so-called midnight judges. In the last days of the Adams administration, the Federalist-dominated Congress passed several acts creating new judgeships within the federal judiciary, and in one of his last acts in office, President Adams appointed Federalists, quickly dubbed the midnight judges, to these new positions. Jeffersonian Republicans feared that the Federalist Party was trying to politicize the judiciary by appointing Federalists who would use their positions to strengthen the powers of the federal government. One of Adams's appointees, William Marbury, sued James Madison, Jefferson's Secretary of State, to receive his commission for his office, but before the case came to trial, Congress, now controlled by Jeffersonian Republicans, repealed the acts. This case, Marbury v. Madison, provoked a landmark decision from the U.S. Supreme Court. At issue was a fundamental constitutional point: was the judiciary independent of politics? In his celebrated 1803 decision in Marbury v. Madison, Chief Justice John Marshall, himself a strong Federalist and an Adams appointee, ruled that Marbury was entitled to his commission but that the Supreme Court did not have the power to force the executive branch to give it to him. At first glance, Jefferson's government appeared to have won the battle. But in the long run, Marshall established the principle that only the federal judiciary could say what the law is, thus unequivocally defending the independence of the judiciary and the principle of judicial review. This was a vital step in realizing the three-way balance of power among the branches of the federal government, executive, legislative, and judiciary, envisaged in the Constitution. Equally important, during his long tenure in office, Chief Justice Marshall consistently led the Supreme Court in a series of decisions that favored the federal government over state governments. Under Marshall's direction, the Supreme Court became a powerful nationalizing force. 9.3.4 Opportunity. The Louisiana Purchase in 1800. The United States was a new and fragile democracy in a world dominated by two contending great powers: Britain and France, who were almost continuously at war from 1789 until 1815, when Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. Jefferson, who had once ardently supported the goals of the French Revolution, viewed Napoleon's ambitions with increasing apprehension. He feared a resumption of the political animosity of the 1790s, when Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans had so bitterly disagreed on policy toward France. In his planning for battles with the British, Napoleon looked at the Caribbean, where he planned to reconquer Haiti, the world's first independent black nation, re-enslave its people, and use the rich profits from sugar to finance his European wars. As a first step, in 1800, France secretly reacquired the Louisiana Territory from Spain, which had held the region since 1763. Napoleon planned to use Louisiana to grow food for sugar-producing Haiti, to counterbalance the British in Canada, and to check any American expansion that might threaten Spain's North American colonies. In 1802, he launched the plan by sending an army of 30,000 to reconquer Haiti. In 1801, when President Jefferson learned of the French-Spanish secret agreement about Louisiana, he was concerned about the threat to American commerce on the Mississippi River. In fact, in 1802, the Spanish commander at New Orleans closed the port to American shippers, thus disrupting commerce as far away as Cincinnati. As Jefferson feared, Federalists in Congress clamored for military action to reopen the port. Jefferson was willing to fight for American commerce, but he first tried diplomacy, with spectacular results. In the summer of 1802, Jefferson instructed Robert Livingston, the American ambassador to France, to try to buy New Orleans and the surrounding area for $2 million. The initial bargaining went badly, but suddenly, in early 1803, Napoleon was ready to sell. His army of 30,000 men had been forced to withdraw from Haiti, defeated by yellow fever and by an army of former slaves led by Toussaint Louverture. In need of money for European military campaigns, Napoleon suddenly offered the entire Louisiana territory, including the crucial port of New Orleans, to the Americans for $15 million. In an age when it took at least 2 months for messages to cross the Atlantic, Special American Envoy James Monroe and Ambassador Livingston could not wait to consult Jefferson. They seized the opportunity. They bought the entire Louisiana territory from Napoleon in Paris in April 1803. Overnight, the size of the United States more than doubled. It was the largest peaceful acquisition of territory in U.S. history. At home, Jefferson suffered brief qualms. The Constitution did not authorize the president to purchase territory, and Jefferson had always rigidly insisted on a limited interpretation of executive rights, but the prize was too rich to pass up. Jefferson now argued that Louisiana was vital to the nation's Republican future. By enlarging the Empire of Liberty, Jefferson wrote, "We provide new sources of renovation, should its principles, at any time, degenerate, in those portions of our country which gave them birth." In other words, expansion was essential to liberty. But for African American slaves and Native Americans, the Louisiana Purchase simply increased the scope of their enslavement and destruction. By 1850, 4 of the 6 states in the Louisiana Purchase had entered the Union as slave states, and Indian Territory, envisaged by Jefferson as a distant refuge for beleaguered Eastern Indian peoples, was surrounded by new settlements. No matter how noble Jefferson's rhetoric, neither African Americans nor American Indians shared. In his Empire of Liberty 9.3.5 Incorporating Louisiana, the immediate issue following the Louisiana Purchase was how to treat the French and Spanish inhabitants of the Louisiana Territory. In 1803, when the region that is now the state of Louisiana became American property, it had a racially and ethnically diverse population of 43,000 people, of whom only 6,000 were American. French and French-speaking people were numerically and culturally dominant, especially in the city of New Orleans. In a population of about 8,000, in addition to the French, there were Germans, Spanish, Irish, Americans and native-born Creoles. 2/3 of the non-white half of the population were slaves, while the remainder were free persons of color, who under French law enjoyed legal rights equal to those of white people, and there was a sizable number of Indians as well. The incorporation of Louisiana into the American federal system thus posed a novel challenge to the many different communities involved, with differing results. The U.S. representative in New Orleans and governor of Lower Louisiana Territory, William Claiborne, slowly learned how to negotiate with the French and Creole elite. With Claiborne's full support, Louisiana adopted a legal code in 1808 that was based on French civil law rather than English common law. This was not a small concession. French law differed from English law in many fundamental respects, such as in family property, in inheritance, and even in contracts, which were much more strictly regulated in the French system. Remnants of the French legal system remain part of Louisiana state law to this day. The losers in the process were the free people of color whose legal rights were curtailed, and the Caddo Indians, in particular, who struggled to maintain the region known as the neutral ground on the Texas-Louisiana border. 9.3.6 Texas and the struggle for Mexican independence. Spain objected in vain to Napoleon's 1803 sale of Louisiana to America. For years, Spain had attempted to seal off its rich colony of Mexico from commerce with other nations. Now, American Louisiana shared a vague and disputed boundary with Mexico's northern province of Texas, which was already coveted by some Americans. Soon Napoleon brought turmoil to all of Mexico. In 1808, having invaded Spain, he installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as king, forcing Spain's king, Charles IV, to renounce his throne. For the next 6 years, as warfare convulsed Spain, the country's long-prized New World empire slipped away. Mexico, divided between royalists loyal to Spain and populists seeking social and economic justice for mestizos and Indians, edged toward independence. Two populist revolts, one in 1810 led by Father Miguel Hidalgo and the other in 1813 led by Father José María Morelos, were suppressed by the royalists, who executed both revolutionary leaders. In 1812, a small force, led by Mexican Republican Bernardo Gutiérrez but composed mostly of American adventurers, invaded Texas, captured San Antonio, assassinated the provincial governor Manuel Salcedo, and declared Texas independent. A year later, however, the Mexican Republicans were defeated by a royalist army, which then killed suspected collaborators and pillaged the province so thoroughly that the local economy was devastated. The Mexican population declined to fewer than 2,000. Under these circumstances, Mexico seemed, at least to some Americans, to offer yet another opportunity for expansion. For years Louisiana seethed with rumors of American plots to invade Texas and set up a separate nation. Among the plotters may have been former Vice President Aaron Burr, who was tried but acquitted in 1807 of treason for his purported plans. 9.4 Renewed imperial rivalry in North America. What unresolved issues between the United States and Britain led to the War of 1812? Fresh from the triumph of the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson scored a major victory over the Federalist Charles Cotesworth Pinckney in the presidential election of 1804, garnering 162 electoral votes to Pinckney's 14. Jefferson's shrewd wooing of moderate Federalists had been so successful that the remaining Federalists dwindled to a highly principled but sectional group, unable to attract voters outside of its home base in New England. However, Jefferson's second term was fraught with fruitless efforts to remain neutral in the ongoing struggle between Britain and France. 9.4.1 Problems with neutral rights. In his first inaugural address in 1801, Jefferson had announced a foreign policy of peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, entangling alliances with none. This was a difficult policy to pursue after 1803, when the Napoleonic Wars resumed. By 1805, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe, but Britain, the victor at the Great Naval Battle of Trafalgar, controlled the seas. The United States, trying to profit from trade with both countries, was caught in the middle. Beginning in 1805, the British targeted the American re-export trade between the Caribbean and France by seizing American ships that were bringing French West Indian goods to Europe. Angry Americans viewed these seizures as violations of their rights as shippers of a neutral nation. An even more contentious issue arose from the substantial desertion rate of British sailors. Many deserters promptly signed up on American ships, where they drew better pay and sometimes obtained false naturalization papers as well. The numbers involved were large, as many as a quarter of the 100,000 seamen on American ships were British. Soon British Navy ships were stopping American merchant vessels and removing any man they believed to be British, regardless of his papers. At least 6,000 innocent American citizens suffered forced impressment into the British Navy from 1803 to 1812. In 1807, impressment turned bloody when the British ship Leopard stopped the American ship Chesapeake in American territorial waters and demanded to search for deserters. When the American captain refused, the Leopard opened fire, killing 3 men. An indignant public protested British interference and the death of innocent sailors. 9.4.2 The Embargo Act. Jefferson insisted on America's right as a neutral nation to ship goods to Europe. He first tried diplomatic protests, then negotiations, and finally threats, all to no avail. In 1806, Congress passed the Non-Importation Act, hoping that a boycott of British goods, which had worked so well during the Revolutionary War, would be effective once again. It was not. Finally, in desperation, Jefferson imposed the Embargo Act in December 1807. This act forbade American ships from sailing to any foreign port, thereby cutting off all exports as well as imports. The intent of the act was to force both Britain and France to recognize neutral rights by depriving them of American-shipped raw materials. But the results were a disaster for American trade. The commerce of the new nation, which Jefferson himself had done so much to promote, came to a standstill. Exports fell from $108 million in 1807 to $22 million in 1808, and the nation was driven into a deep depression. There was widespread evasion of the embargo. Smuggling flourished. Pointing out that the American Navy's weakness was due largely to the deep cuts Jefferson had inflicted on it, the Federalists sprang to life with a campaign of outspoken opposition, and they found a ready audience in New England, the area hardest hit by the embargo. 9.4.3 Madison and the failure of peaceable coercion. In this troubled atmosphere, Thomas Jefferson despondently ended his second term, acknowledging the failure of what he called peaceable coercion. He was followed in office by his friend and colleague James Madison of Virginia. Although Madison defeated the Federalist candidate, again Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, by 122 electoral votes to 47, Pinckney's share of the votes was 3 times what it had been in 1804. Ironically, the Embargo Act had almost no effect on its intended victims. The French used the embargo as a pretext for seizing American ships, claiming they must be British ships in disguise. The British, in the absence of American competition, developed new markets for their goods in South America. In March 1809, Congress admitted failure, and the Embargo Act was repealed. But the struggle to remain neutral in the confrontation between the European giants continued. The next 2 years saw passage of several acts, among them the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 and Macon's Bill No. 2 in 1810, that unsuccessfully attempted to prohibit trade with Britain and France unless they ceased their hostile treatment of U.S. shipping. Frustration with the ineffectiveness of government policy mounted. 9.4.4 A contradictory Indian policy. The United States faced other conflicts besides those with Britain and France over neutral shipping rights. In the West, the powerful Indian nations of the Ohio Valley were determined to resist the wave of expansion that had carried thousands of white settlers onto their lands. According to the Indian Intercourse Act of 1790, the United States could not simply seize Indian land, it could only acquire it when the Indians ceded it by treaty. But this policy conflicted with the harsh reality of westward expansion. Commonly, settlers pushed ahead of treaty boundaries. When Indian peoples resisted the invasion of their lands, the pioneers fought back and called for military protection. Defeat of an Indian people led to further land cessions. The result for the Indians was a relentless cycle of invasion, resistance, and defeat. Thomas Jefferson was deeply concerned with the fate of the Western Indian peoples. Convinced that Indians had to give up hunting in favor of the yeoman farmer lifestyle he so favored for all Americans, Jefferson directed the governors of the Northwest Territories to promote energetically his vision for civilizing the Indians, which included Christianizing them and teaching them to read. Many Indian peoples actively resisted these efforts at conversion. In addition, Jefferson's Indian civilization plan was never fully supported by territorial governors and settlers. After the Louisiana Purchase, Jefferson offered traditionalist Indian groups new lands west of the Mississippi River, where they could live undisturbed by white settlers. But he failed to consider the pace of westward expansion. In fact, Jefferson's Indian policy, because it did nothing to slow down the ever-accelerating westward expansion, offered little hope to Indian peoples. The alternatives they faced were stark: acculturation, removal, or extinction. Deprived of hunting lands, decimated by disease, increasingly dependent on the white economy for trade goods and annuity payments in exchange for land cessions, many Indian peoples despaired. Like the Mandans after Lewis and Clark's visit, they came to dread the effects of white contact. Nearly every tribe found itself bitterly split between accommodationists and traditionalists. 9.5 Indian alternatives and the War of 1812. What were the causes of pan-Indian resistance and how did the War of 1812 resolve them? There was no escape from white encroachment. Between 1801 and 1809, William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, concluded 15 treaties with the Delawares, Potawatomis, Miamis, and other tribes. These treaties opened eastern Michigan, southern Indiana, and most of Illinois to white settlement and forced the Indians onto ever smaller reservations. Many of these treaties were obtained by coercion, bribery, and outright trickery, and most Indians did not accept them. 9.5.1 The Pan-Indian Military Resistance Movement. The Shawnees, a semi-nomadic hunting and farming tribe of the Ohio Valley, had resisted white settlement in Kentucky and Ohio since the 1750s. Anthony Wayne's decisive defeat of the Indian Confederacy led by Little Turtle at Fallen Timbers, and the continuing pressure of American settlement, however, had left the Shawnees divided. One group, about 1/4 of the total, led by Black Hoof, tried to retain tribal homelands by accepting acculturation directed by government officials and missionaries. The rest of the tribe tried to maintain traditional ways. The vast majority broke into small bands and moved west of the Mississippi to Missouri, where they remained until removed again to eastern Kansas in 1825. One small group of militant Shawnees, however, led by the warrior Tecumseh, refused to move west and embarked on a pan-Indian military resistance movement that rapidly became famous. In 1805, Tecumseh's brother, Tenskwatawa, known as the Prophet, began preaching a message of Indian revitalization, a rejection of all contact with the Americans, including the use of American alcohol, clothing, and trade goods, and a return to traditional practices of hunting and farming. If the Northwest Indians return to traditional ways, Tenskwatawa promised, the land will be overturned so that all the white people will be covered and you alone shall inhabit the land. Tecumseh succeeded in molding his brother's religious following into a powerful pan-Indian military resistance movement. With each new treaty that Harrison concluded, Tecumseh gained new followers among the Northwest Confederation tribes. Significantly, he also had the support of the British, who, after 1807, began sending food and guns to him from Canada, and who promised an alliance with the Indians if war broke out between Britain and America. Tecumseh's pan-Indian strategy was at first primarily defensive, aimed at preventing further westward expansion. But after the Treaty of Fort Wayne in 1809, in which the United States gained 3 million acres of Delaware and Potawatomi land in Indiana, Tecumseh moved from passive to active resistance. Confronting Harrison directly, Tecumseh argued that the land belonged to the larger community of all the Indian peoples. No one tribe could give away the common property of all. He then warned that any surveyors or settlers who ventured into the 3 million acres would risk their lives. Tecumseh took his message of common land ownership and military resistance to all the Indian peoples of the Northwest Confederacy. He was not uniformly successful, even among the Shawnees. Black Hoof, for example, refused to join. Tecumseh also recruited, with mixed success, among the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Cherokee tribes south of the Ohio River. In November 1811, while Tecumseh was still recruiting among the southern tribes, Harrison marched to the pan-Indian village of Tippecanoe with 1,000 soldiers, and in the battle that followed, the Americans inflicted about 150 Indian casualties, while sustaining about as many themselves. Although Harrison claimed victory, the truth was far different. Dispersed from Tippecanoe, Tecumseh's angry followers fell on American settlements in Indiana and southern Michigan, killing many pioneers and forcing the rest to flee to fortified towns. Tecumseh himself entered into a formal alliance with the British. For Western settlers, the Indian threat was greater than ever. 9.5.2 The War of 1812. Many Westerners blamed the British for Tecumseh's attacks on pioneer settlements in the Northwest. British support of Western Indians and the long-standing difficulties over neutral shipping rights were the two grievances cited by President Madison when he asked Congress for a declaration of war against Britain on June 1, 1812. Congress obliged him on June 18. But the war had other, more general causes as well. The war hawks, a rising young generation of political leaders, first elected to Congress in 1810, strongly resented the continuing influence of Britain on American affairs. These war hawks, who included such future leaders as Henry Clay of Kentucky and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, were young Jeffersonian Republicans from the West and South. They found all aspects of British interference, such as impressment of sailors and support for Western Indians, intolerable. Eager to assert independence from England once and for all, these young men saw themselves finishing the job begun by the aging Revolutionary generation. They also wanted to occupy Florida to prevent runaway slaves from seeking refuge with the Seminole Indians. Westerners wanted to invade Canada, hoping thereby to end threats from British-backed Indians in the Northwest, such as Tecumseh and his followers. As resentments against England and frustrations over border issues merged, the pressure for war, always a strong force for national unity, mounted. Unaware that the British, seriously hurt by the American trade embargo, were about to adopt a more conciliatory policy, President James Madison yielded to the war hawks' clamor for action in June 1812, and his declaration of war passed the U.S. Senate by the close vote of 19-13, the House by 79-49. All the Federalists voted against the war. The vote was sectional, with New England and the Middle States in opposition and the West and South strongly pro-war. Thus, the United States entered the War of 1812 more deeply divided along sectional lines than during any other foreign war in American history. As a result of Jefferson's economizing, the American Army and Navy were small and weak. In contrast, the British, fresh from almost 10 years of Napoleonic wars, were in fighting trim. At sea, the British Navy quickly established a strong blockade, harassing coastal shipping along the Atlantic seaboard and attacking coastal settlements at will. In the most humiliating attack, the British burned Washington in the summer of 1814, forcing the President and Congress to flee. Dolly Madison, the President's wife, achieved a permanent footnote in history by saving a portrait of George Washington from the White House as she fled. There were a few American naval successes. The American frigate Constitution, known as Old Ironsides, destroyed 2 British men of war, the Guerriere and the Java, in classic naval battles, but these failed to lift the British blockade. The campaigns against the northern and southern Indians, the American goal of expansion, fared badly as well. Americans envisaged a quick victory over sparsely populated British Canada that would destroy British support for Tecumseh and his Northwest Indian allies, but instead the British-Indian alliance defeated them. In July 1812, an American foray into Western Canada was repulsed. A joint British and Indian force went on, in August, to capture Detroit and Fort Dearborn. In September 1813, at the Battle of Put-in Bay, Captain Oliver H. Perry established American control over Lake Erie, leading to the recapture of Detroit by William Henry Harrison. Assisted by naval forces commanded by Perry, Harrison defeated British and Indian defenders in the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. Among those slain in the battle was Tecumseh, fighting on the British side. Later attempts by the United States to invade Canada in the Niagara area failed, but so too did British attempts to invade the United States in the same area.
Although the invading Americans had mistakenly expected victory, because the majority of Canadians outside of Quebec were former Americans, the most decisive effect of the American attacks was the formation of a Canadian sense of national identity and a determination never to be invaded or absorbed by the United States. In the South, warfare similar to that waged against Tecumseh's pan-Indian resistance movement in the Northwest